Summer 1944, Bavaria. It wasn't better tactics. It wasn't more aluminum. It was physics. Jet propulsion that made every Allied piston engine obsolete the moment the first Me-262 climbed past 500 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, Swallow, was the world's first operational jet fighter. Twin Jumo 004 turbojets, top speed 540 miles per hour in level flight, ceiling above 37,000 feet. 4 Mk-108 cannon punching 1.5 pounds of explosive per second into bomber formations that couldn't run and couldn't hide. On paper, it was untouchable. In reality, it nearly wasn't built at all. The jet engine wasn't new in 1944. Hans von Ohain ran Germany's first turbojet on the bench in 1937. The Heinkel He 178 flew in August 1939, 5 days before the invasion of Poland, reaching 435 miles per hour with a single centrifugal engine. Britain's Frank Whittle had been sketching turbojets since 1930, filing his first patent in 1932. Both nations knew jets were coming. Both nations knew the strategic implications. Germany got there first. By 1941, Messerschmitt had begun design work on a twin-engine jet fighter. The challenge wasn't theory. It was metallurgy, thermodynamics, and mass production. Early prototypes used BMW 003 engines. They failed repeatedly. Compressor blades cracked, combustion chambers warped. Test pilots reported flameouts at altitude. The breakthrough came with Junkers Jumo 004. By 1943, Messerschmitt's design team had mated 2 axial flow Jumo 004s to a sleek swept-wing airframe. The 262 hit 520 miles per hour in tests at Rechlin. Allied intelligence intercepted reports, but dismissed them as exaggeration. No piston fighter anywhere broke 450 miles per hour in level flight. The P-51D Mustang, the best American escort, topped out at 437 miles per hour. The Spitfire Mark 14, 448 miles per hour. The Soviet Yak-3, 407 miles per hour. The Me-262 was 100 miles per hour faster. It carried 4 Mk-108 30mm autocannon clustered in the nose. A 2-second burst delivered 24 rounds, weighing 330 grams each. 1 shell could tear the wing off a B-17. 3 shells could break a Lancaster's spine. Allied bombers, built to absorb dozens of .50 caliber hits, had no defense against that firepower at closing speeds above 600 miles per hour. The math was lethal. Test pilots at Rechlin reported engagement profiles that seemed impossible. Dive from 30,000 feet, accelerate to 550 miles per hour, close on bomber formation from 6 o'clock high, fire from 600 yards, well outside effective range of defensive .50 caliber turrets, break away in a climbing turn no piston fighter could follow. Bomber gunners would see the jet for less than 8 seconds. Not enough time to track, not enough time to lead, not enough time to do anything except watch it vanish. But Adolf Hitler saw the footage and asked the wrong question. November 2nd, 1943, Insterburg. Hitler watched the Me-262 demonstration. Sleek, fast, brutal. The jet screamed past the reviewing stand at 400 miles per hour, pulled vertical, climbed to 15,000 feet in 90 seconds. When the pilots landed, Hitler turned to Messerschmitt and General Oberst Erhard Milch. "Can this aircraft carry bombs?" Willy Messerschmitt hesitated. "Ja, mein Führer. Perhaps 500 kilograms, but it is designed as a fighter. The airframe is optimized for speed and climb rate, not payload." Hitler cut him off. "Then it will be a bomber. We need a fast bomber that can reach England and return before the RAF scrambles. The enemy bombs our cities with impunity. We will strike back. Production begins immediately as the Sturmvogel, not the Schwalbe." Sturmvogel, Stormbird, a bomber. Milch and the Luftwaffe's fighter command protested quietly. Germany was hemorrhaging bombers over the Reich. 600 lost in October 1943 alone during the Schweinfurt raids. American B-17s were flying 300 plane missions in daylight. RAF Lancasters hit industrial targets at night. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was being ground down by attrition it couldn't sustain. The Me-262 could intercept B-17 formations at altitudes and speeds no Allied escort could match. As a bomber, it would carry two 250-kilogram bombs, a trivial payload, while sacrificing the one advantage that mattered, speed intercepting Allied heavies. A single Bf-109 could carry 250 kilograms of bombs. Germany had thousands of Bf-19s. The objections went nowhere. Hitler wanted revenge for Allied city bombing. Hamburg had burned in July 1943, 40,000 dead in a firestorm that consumed 8 square miles. Berlin was being hit weekly. Strategic air defense could wait, vengeance couldn't. Development pivoted. Engineers reinforced the fuselage for bomb racks. Test schedules slipped, factories retooled, 6 months evaporated. By spring 1944, Allied bombers were flying 1,000 plane raids with near impunity. The Luftwaffe's day fighter arm was dying. Pilot losses in the first quarter, 2,262 dead. Fuel shortages grounded entire Geschwader. Aircraft sat on airfields without gasoline. Replacement pilots arrived with 40 hours of training, barely enough to land without crashing, let alone fight P-51s. The Reich needed the Me-262 as an interceptor. Hitler still wanted a bomber. The delay cascaded through Germany's industrial system like a poison. Messerschmitt factories in Regensburg had tooling ready for fighter production in January 1944. The bomber conversion order froze assembly lines for 3 months. Engineers redesigned wing hardpoints to carry bombs. Hydraulic systems needed modification for bomb release mechanisms. Electrical wiring had to be rerouted. Wind tunnel testing began again to verify stability with external stores. Every change burned weeks. Every week cost lives. Meanwhile, the air war intensified beyond anything the Luftwaffe could counter. February 1944. Big week. The 8th Air Force launched 3,300 bomber sorties against German aircraft factories in 6 days. Losses: 226 bombers, 28 fighters. American crews called it a bloodbath, but production disruption was catastrophic. Messerschmitt's Regensburg plant, building both Bf-10-9s and preparing Me-262's tooling, took direct hits from 500-pound bombs. The main assembly hall collapsed. Tooling was buried under rubble. Output dropped 30% for 2 months. March 1944. The first Berlin raids, 660 bombers over the capital in daylight. Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them and were slaughtered. American gunners had learned to concentrate fire. Formations flew tighter. P-51 escorts had drop tanks now, range enough to dogfight over Berlin itself. The Reich lost 160 pilots in 5 days. Experienced men. Squadron leaders with 50 victories, flight instructors pulled from training schools, irreplaceable men, the kind who could transition to jets and teach others. April 1944. Allied fighters began long-range penetration missions with drop tanks. P-51s could now escort bombers to any target in Germany and still have fuel to dogfight for 30 minutes. Luftwaffe day fighter losses doubled. Squadrons that once fielded 40 aircraft struggled to put 12 in the air. Some flew with 8, some with 4. May 1944. The oil campaign began. American heavy bombers targeted synthetic fuel plants across Germany. Leuna, Politz, Merseburg, Brucks. These plants produced 90% of Germany's aviation fuel. Every raid dropped output. Every week tightened the noose. The Me-262 sat in hangars, being fitted with bomb racks nobody wanted. June 6, 1944. Allied armies landed in Normandy. The Luftwaffe scraped together 300 sorties on D-Day. The Allies flew 14,000. German pilots who survived the first week reported formations so large they blotted out the sky. Flak batteries ran out of ammunition. Fighter units pulled back to bases in Germany. Fuel was too scarce to waste on unwinnable battles. The Me-262 could have made a difference. FW-190S and BF-109S couldn't penetrate Allied fighter screens. A jet could. A jet could hit ground targets and be gone before Spitfires turned to engage, but the jets were still being converted to bombers. July 1944, Lechfeld, Erprobungskommando 262, the operational test unit, finally took delivery of the first production fighters, 30 aircraft. Experienced pilots pulled from day fighter squadrons. Permission, at last, to use the jet as a fighter. The results were immediate. August 28, 1944, Major Walter Nowotny shot down a B-17 near Leipzig. His combat report described the engagement in clinical detail. Approached from 5 o'clock high at 540 miles per hour. Target could not maneuver. Fired 4-second burst from 400 meters. Observed strikes on starboard wing and fuselage. Bomber exploded, broke right, and climbed to 9,000 meters. No Allied fighter closed within firing range. Closing speed, 150 miles per hour, faster than any P-51 escort. The fortress exploded in one pass. No Allied fighter could catch him in the dive or the climb. September 1944. Commando Nowotny claimed 22 Allied aircraft in 3 weeks. Loss rate, 6 Me, 262 seconds. Most losses were on takeoff or landing. The Jumo 004s needed 30 seconds to spool from idle to full thrust, leaving jets vulnerable during the climb. Pilots called it the critical moment. Wheels up, airspeed building, engines still accelerating. A sitting target for any fighter at altitude. Allied pilots learned fast. Don't chase the 262 in level flight. You'll burn fuel and accomplish nothing. Instead, loiter near known jet bases at 10,000 feet and bounce them during approach. Every Me-262 had to land eventually. Every landing approach meant 60 seconds below 300 miles per hour with flaps down and gear extended. Vulnerable. But in fair engagements, jet versus piston at altitude, the Me-262 was untouchable. October 7, 1944, near Akmar, Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group caught 2 Me-262s on landing approach at 200 feet. Both jets had gear down, flaps extended, throttles at idle to bleed speed. Drew dove from 3,000 feet, fired from 300 yards, and watched both jets tumble into the forest north of the runway. His after-action report was filed with grudging respect. At any other altitude, there is no catching them. They are 100 miles per hour, faster, and can outclimb anything we have. The only chance is to hit them on approach when they're slow and committed. The tactical solution was clear. Produce jets faster than the Allies could destroy them on the ground, disperse them to satellite fields, train pilots to land fast and get off the runway within 30 seconds, build revetments, hide them in forests. Germany couldn't. The Jumo 004 turbojet was a marvel and a disaster. Axial flow compressor, 8 stages, 1,980 pounds of thrust at 8,700 RPM. Operational lifespan, 25 hours before turbine blade failure. The British Whittle engine, centrifugal design, heavier, less efficient, lasted 150 hours between overhauls. American engines were reaching 180 hours in testing. Why the difference? Nickel-chromium alloy. Britain had it from Commonwealth sources. America had it from domestic mines. Germany didn't. By 1944, the Reich's strategic metal stocks were exhausted. Chrome imports from Turkey had stopped. Nickel shipments from Finland were disrupted by Soviet offensives. Messerschmitt's engineers substituted mild steel turbine blades, cheaper, available, and utterly inadequate. The turbine section of a jet engine operates at 850 degrees Celsius. Nickel-chromium alloys maintain structural integrity at those temperatures. Mild steel does not. Blades warped under thermal stress, engines flamed out, compressor discs shattered, sending shrapnel through the engine housing at supersonic velocity. Pilots reported catastrophic turbine failure as a euphemism for engines that exploded in flight. Field crews swapped engines after every 10 flight hours as preventive maintenance. Sometimes engines lasted 15 hours, sometimes 8. No one knew. The uncertainty meant jets sat on the ground, while mechanics pulled engines just in case. Production was worse. Germany built 1,433 Me-262s between April 1944 and April 1945. On paper, impressive. In context, catastrophic. In the same 12-month period, the United States produced 7,000 P-51 Mustangs. Britain delivered 2,000 Spitfires. The Soviet Union built 15,000 fighters, mostly Yak-3s and La-7s. Germany's entire jet production equaled 2 weeks of American piston fighter output, and most Me-262s never reached operational squadrons. Allied bombing destroyed 120 jets on the ground before they flew a single combat mission. Another 200 were damaged in transit. Rail lines were priority targets, and jets shipped by train were vulnerable. Roughly 100 Me-262s were lost to training accidents. New pilots transitioning from Bf-109s misjudged landing speeds or stalled on approach. Of 1,433 built, fewer than 400 saw combat. Germany's fuel allocation for jets in January 1945, 50 flight hours total across all units. That number included training, ferry flights, and combat sorties. Commanders had to ration missions. Pilots sat in ready rooms while jets sat on runways, tanks empty. The Me-262 force peaked at 200 operational aircraft in March 1945. Nowhere near enough, but the numbers only tell part of the story. Training was catastrophic. Pre-war, Luftwaffe pilots received 250 hours of flight training before joining operational squadrons. By 1944, that number had dropped to 110 hours. By early 1945, 60 hours. New Me-262 pilots, if they were lucky, received 10 hours of jet transition time. Most got less, some got none. The Jumo 004 required careful throttle management. Rapid throttle movements caused compressor stalls, backfires that could destroy the engine. Overheating at altitude caused flameouts. The throttle had to be advanced slowly, smoothly, with constant attention to exhaust temperature gauges. Push it too hard and the engine quit. Baby it too much, and you didn't have enough thrust to climb or accelerate. Pilots accustomed to Bf-109s, forgiving, responsive, mechanical, found the 262 unforgiving and temperamental. Accident rates soared. In October 1944 alone, 14 Me-262s were lost to non-combat causes: flameouts on takeoff, compressor failures during landing, engine fires during startup. One pilot pushed the throttle too hard on approach and watched both engines quit at 300 feet. He ejected. The jet cartwheeled into a forest and exploded. Another pilot landed with one engine out, touched down too fast, ran off the runway, and hit a drainage ditch at 90 miles per hour. The jet disintegrated. The pilot survived with a broken back. Allied bombing compounded the problem. Me-262 bases required long, smooth runways. Jets couldn't operate from grass strips like Bf-10-9s. The landing speed was 115 miles per hour. The takeoff run was 700 meters. Rough fields meant blown tires, collapsed gear, or worse. The Allies knew this. Every known jet field was targeted. Runway cratering forced constant repairs. Crews worked at night with shielded lamps, filling bomb craters with rubble and paving them over with whatever materials were available: asphalt, concrete, crushed stone. Dispersal became mandatory. Jets hid in forests under camouflage nets between sorties. Mechanics worked in the open, exposed to strafing attacks. Refueling was done by hand. Fuel trucks couldn't risk driving to forest hides in daylight. Fuel delivery collapsed in winter 1944. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, producing 90% of aviation gasoline by late 1944, were priority targets for Allied heavy bombers. The Leuna plant near Leipzig, producing 600 tons of fuel daily in May 1944, was hit 22 times between May and December. By December, output had dropped to 50 tons per day, less than 10% of capacity. The Pulitz plant in Pomerania produced 400 tons daily in June. It was hit 9 times by August. Output, 40 tons per day. By January 1945, Luftwaffe fuel stock stood at 11,000 tons, enough for 2 weeks of normal operations across all units. The Me-262 squadrons, despite priority allocation, received barely enough fuel to fly training missions. Combat sorties were rationed to critical missions only. One squadron commander wrote in his diary, "We have 18 serviceable jets. We have fuel for 4 sorties. I must choose which pilots fly and which stay behind. It is an impossible decision." And then there was pilot attrition. Walter Nowotny, 258 victories, Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, pioneer jet ace, died November 8, 1944. His Me-262 was hit by a P-51 during landing approach near Akmar. Cannon shells tore through the left engine and fuselage. The jet rolled inverted at 150 feet. Nowotny didn't eject. The jet hit the ground at 200 miles per hour and disintegrated. He was 23 years old. Germany's best pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. The Luftwaffe lost 2,600 pilots between January and April 1945, killed in action, missing, or captured. New pilots arriving at jet squadrons had 100 flight hours total, barely enough to solo a Bf-109, let alone master a jet. The Me-262 required experts. It demanded smooth hands, constant attention, situational awareness honed by hundreds of combat missions. Novice pilots made mistakes. Mistakes in a jet were usually fatal. By March 1945, the war was contracting around the Reich like a noose tightening day by day. Soviet forces pushed from the east. 200 divisions, 15,000 tanks, advancing 20 miles per day. Allied armies crossed the Rhine on March 7th at Remagen. Within a week, 5 Allied armies were across the river, driving into the industrial heart of Germany. Jet bases in Western Germany were overrun within days. Pilots evacuated aircraft to Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, anywhere with intact runways and fuel stocks. Some jets were flown to Denmark, to Norway, anywhere the Allies hadn't reached yet. It wasn't enough. April 1945. The last operational Me-262 units, JG-7 and KG-J-54, flew from Autobahn strips and forest clearings in Bavaria. Fuel arrived in horse-drawn carts scavenged from abandoned farms. Ammunition was pulled from depots ahead of advancing American tanks. Replacement engines didn't exist. Jets that flamed out were cannibalized for parts to keep others flying. Pilots flew 2, sometimes 3 sorties per day when fuel allowed. They attacked American bomber formations over Munich, over Nuremberg, over what was left of German-held territory. They claimed kills. They lost jets to engine failures, to P-51s, to ground fire. On April 19, 1945, JG-7 flew its final combat sorties from a cratered highway near Munich. Soviet tanks were 40 miles east. American spearheads were 20 miles west. There was nowhere left to retreat. Pilots landed their jets in farm fields, removed the gun sights and radios, anything that might be useful to the enemy, and walked toward Allied lines carrying white flags improvised from bedsheets. The war was over. The jets were silent. Total Allied aircraft destroyed by Me-262s, approximately 730 confirmed, possibly 200 more unconfirmed. Total Me-262S produced, 1,433. Total Me-262S operational at peak strength, 200. Total combat sorties flown, roughly 2,400. Kill ratio per operational jet, 3.65 to 1. Impressive by any standard, irrelevant in context. The question haunts historians. What if Hitler had approved the Me-262 as a fighter in November 1943, 6 months earlier? What if the Jumo 004 had used proper alloys, adding 100 hours to engine life? What if Germany had prioritized 3,000 jets instead of 1,400? What if pilots had received proper training instead of being rushed into combat with 10 hours in type? The Allied strategic bombing campaign, already costly, would have become unsustainable. In late 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 10% of bombers dispatched on deep penetration raids. That loss rate was considered acceptable because targets were being hit and Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing. A force of 300 operational jets, properly supplied and piloted by experienced aviators, could have pushed bomber losses to 20%, the threshold the USAAF considered prohibitive. At 20% losses, the strategic bombing campaign would have been unsustainable. Crews would have refused to fly. Generals would have been forced to reconsider tactics, perhaps halt daylight raids entirely. Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris admitted in 1947, if they had gotten 262s into service 6 months sooner in real numbers, say 500 aircraft with adequate fuel and experienced pilots, we would have had to reconsider the entire daylight campaign. The loss rates would have been unacceptable. But 6 months was an eternity in 1944. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Every month of delay cost Germany resources it couldn't replace: pilots, fuel, time, territory. By summer 1944, when the Me-262 finally reached squadrons in meaningful numbers, the Reich's strategic situation was terminal. No weapon, however advanced, could reverse the momentum of 10 million Allied troops, 50,000 tanks, and 30,000 aircraft converging from 3 directions. Germany was being crushed by industrial capacity it couldn't match and attrition it couldn't sustain. The Me-262 was extraordinary. It proved jet propulsion was achievable, practical, and devastating when deployed correctly. It proved that speed and firepower could overcome numerical superiority, at least tactically. It also proved that technology alone doesn't win wars. Logistics win wars. Industrial capacity wins wars. Training wins wars. Germany had the technology. It lacked everything else. Within 18 months of Germany's surrender, Britain flew the Gloucester Meteor in combat over Europe. The Soviet Union captured several Me-262s intact and reverse-engineered the Jumo 004 into the RD-10 engine. The MiG-9 and Yak-15, both powered by copied German engines, flew by 1946. The United States shipped 12 captured Me-262s to Wright Field in Ohio. Engineers disassembled them bolt by bolt. They studied the swept wings, the engine mounts, the control systems. Lessons learned went into the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet, flying by late 1945. By 1950, every major air force on Earth operated jets. By 1953, jet fighters dominated the skies over Korea. The F-86 Sabre, swept wings, axial flow engine, 680 miles per hour, owed its design lineage directly to the Me-262. So did the Soviet MiG-15. So did Britain's Hawker Hunter. The jet age had arrived. The Swallow didn't change the war. It arrived too late, in too few numbers, with too many compromises. But it changed what came after. The proof, delivered at 540 miles per hour over Bavaria, that the propeller age was already history, and the future belonged to turbojets, swept wings and speeds that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. Germany built the first operational jet fighter. It proved the concept. It terrified Allied aircrews. It forced every air force to rethink fighter design. And then Germany ran out of time to use it. The jets fell silent. The runways were captured. The pilots walked into captivity. And the age of the jet fighter, born in the desperation of a collapsing regime, spread across the world.